All right, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Again, good evening. Thanks for joining us, or good afternoon, perhaps, depending on when you're joining us from. My name is Brian Silva. I'm the Vice President of Outreach and Engagement here at Americans United for Separation of Church and State. I use he, him pronouns. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. First of all, you'll notice on screen that we do have ASL interpretation. Hopefully everybody's able to see that. If not, please go ahead and let us know in the Q&A box. You also should see closed captioning at the bottom of your screen, or the ability to turn it on. By clicking at the bottom of the Zoom screen, there's a button that says Show Subtitle, which should allow you to see that as well. We're happy to take as many of your questions as we can this evening, which we'll do towards the at the second half of the webinar. Go ahead, also at the bottom of your screen, there is a button for Q&A. You can click that and pose your questions there. We will try to get to as many as we possibly can, and apologies in advance if we miss yours. And a final reminder that this is being recorded, and it will be provided to all registrants, whether you're here this evening or not, tomorrow in a follow-up email thanking you for joining us, so that you can go back, watch some of your favorite moments, or get your questions re-answered. Again, like I said, my name is Brian and I'm with Americans United. AU is the only organization dedicated solely to defending the separation of church and state. We're the shield protecting the foundational American principle of freedom of religion, including the right to believe or not believe for all, and the right to practice those beliefs so long as it doesn't harm others. This webinar is unique and the first in a series as part of our Summit for Religious Freedom. The Summit for Religious Freedom is culminating this spring in April in Washington, D.C. at our conference to be held there and virtually for those who are not able to attend. One of the unique parts of SURF, the Summit for Religious Freedom, is it's a continuous conference. So events like these webinars will be held throughout the year for folks who are registered. Because this is our kickoff year, we're making those webinars available to anyone who wants to register. But this is just a small example of what you'll be able to experience by joining us at SURF, either in Washington, D.C. or virtually. And just a quick peek here about showing you our SURF website, thesurfsrf.org. Again, April 22nd through the 24th in DC. Registration is open. Early bird discount goes until Monday. We also have scholarships available. We know that conferences are not always easy for folks to attend that can help to cover both travel, hotel, and registration, or any combination of those. We also have scholarships to be able to cover the cost of virtual attendance. So those scholarships are on a rolling basis, but we encourage you to apply for them as soon as possible. We also have some amazing speakers already confirmed. Dr. Anthea Butler, Professor of Religion at the University of Pennsylvania and author of White Evangelical Racism. And invited Congressman Jamie Raskin, who I think so many of you already know and goes without introduction. And one of our keynote speakers you'll get to hear from this evening as well, President and CEO of Americans United, Rachel Lazar. All right, the last piece before we get started, just as a reminder, since we are talking about elections, Americans United, like churches, is a nonprofit and therefore bound by IRS regulations and the Johnson Amendment. These regulations forbid us and churches and any nonprofit from endorsing any political party or candidate in a local, state, or federal election. So nothing we talk about tonight should be inferred as endorsing any candidate or former candidate or political party. And with that, I'm very excited to turn it over to Rachel Lazar.
Thanks, Brian, and good evening, good afternoon, everyone. It's so wonderful to be with you. I wish I could see you as normal. I'm going to actually ask us to start in a radical way My staff would not be surprised. I'm going to ask everyone who is on this Zoom, and I see that there's hundreds of you, to join me in taking a very deep breath, holding it in, and then we're gonna let it out with a lot of noise, okay? So I can't hear you, but I'm gonna trust you. So everybody, inhale, hold it. Now let it out. Because this election could have been a lot worse. That's really my main message that I want to convey. And I know you all have been feeling that. I think it's so important that we take these pauses to realize that things could be worse, that we all are in community together, and that the reason we've been witnessing such hard times is in part because we're on the winning side of history. And I think that's what we saw in this election. So I want to start by celebrating, in particular, Generation Z. Not sure how many of you all are with us tonight, but you showed up in phenomenal numbers, in record numbers for this midterm. And in particular, Gen Z women showed up. And I'm very proud to have 3 kids in this cohort. What an amazing and activist generation. Also want to celebrate that in all 5 places where abortion was on the ballot, voters rejected this infringement on their religious freedom and reproductive freedom. From California to Vermont to Michigan, sorry, I'm all over the map here, and even in Montana and Kentucky. Election deniers and Christian nationalists also largely, though not entirely, lost in this election. And I want to give one local example that I think is a good one. In Michigan, out of 172 extremist school board candidates, the kind that want to ban books, for example, who ran in suburban counties, 129, which is 76% of them, lost. Right? And that held true even in rural parts of Michigan, where 73% of extremist school board candidates lost. A number of firsts that continue to move us towards our country's promise of equality also happened. Massachusetts is the first state to elect an openly lesbian governor in this country, Governor Maura Healey. The first Generation Z member of the House ever was elected, Maxwell Frost. The first Black governor was elected in Maryland, Wes Moore. And a record number of women governors were elected in the US. Before it was 9 and now it's 12. Pretty good. Also celebrating that the most LGBTQ candidates in history won. And the last I checked, it was 340 people, LGBTQ candidates who were victorious this midterms. And it includes New Hampshire's James Rosner, who's the first trans man elected to a state legislature. So stepping back from all this, I went into this election wondering the most whether people were going to have hope. Whether after everything we've been through in recent years, from coronavirus to gun violence to extensive racism to wars, whether people were gonna believe in the power of their voices enough to show up. And what I think we saw is that the majority of Americans recognize the threat to our democracy right now, and they did show up. And that's incredibly hopeful. And Americans United is going to continue to do our part to both educate, but also to inspire such hope going forward. So enough said from me. I want to introduce our wonderful panelists and my colleagues. I'll start with Maggie Garrett, who's our vice president, long-term vice president for public policy and a church-state separation expert par none. And we'll also be joined tonight by our newer, not so new anymore, and wonderful Vice President for Communications, Andrew Seidel, who also is the author of a new and exciting book that you should all buy. And he can sign your copy even, so you let us know. It's called American Crusade: How the Supreme Court is Weaponizing Religious Freedom. So we'll talk about the election and Christian nationalism and church-state separation and religious freedom. And I will turn it back to you, Brian, to take us into the conversation.
Great, thanks, Rachel. Andrew, let's go ahead and start with you and dig right down into one of the things I think a lot of folks were concerned about, this threat to democracy. Did those fears play out in the results? And are you relieved?
I'm actually very relieved. I was seriously worried about violence as kind of the most potent and alarming threat to democracy that we saw in past elections, and going into this election, I was worried about it. But there are, of course, other threats to democracy. Actually, Professor Anthea Butler, who is going to be one of our keynotes at the Summit for Religious Freedom, and which you should all totally sign up for, was also worried about the potential for political violence this election. We were chatting about it on Twitter in the run-up. But like Rachel, I'm also breathing this sigh of relief. And I think one of the saving graces, I think one of the things that made this election different is not just the people and the voters, but also that Trump was neither on the ballot nor in power. The people who were in power, in charge of our military, in charge of law enforcement, were not interested in seeing a repeat of something like January 6th or allowing violence. And I think they really understood the threats. That said, we did see some voter intimidation, but largely in the places and races that had me the most concerned. We saw candidates who I was worried about concede rather than deny reality or try their hand at some sort of stochastic terrorism. So for instance, you had Pennsylvania gubernatorial candidate Doug Mastriano conceded relatively peacefully, though he did include some similar language that he used in his concession speech that he used in the lead up to the January 6th insurrection. But then there were the other threats to democracy too, because violence isn't the only threat to democracy. And one of the thoughts that I keep coming back to, Brian, in the wake of this election is, what would this election look like? What would it have been had there not been that racial gerrymandering, the partisan gerrymandering, the vote suppression, the anti-democracy judges, the gutted Voting Rights Act, and a packed Supreme Court, right? Because the judiciary had an outsized impact on this case, and not just on the abortion issue, making that an issue, but actually in giving electoral maps to one party or the other. So the Supreme Court okayed partisan gerrymandering a couple of years ago, and we know that netted the Republicans about 4 House seats in Florida and 4 or 5 House seats in New York, because a relatively conservative high court there actually appointed a special master to redraw the maps, and essentially that special master created this conservative gerrymander there. And then there's the racial gerrymander and the Supreme Court's refusal to correct it. So in Merrill versus Mulligan in February, the Supreme Court essentially suspended the Voting Rights Act ban on racial gerrymandering and then reinstituted racially gerrymandered maps in Alabama. And then other lower federal court judges followed suit in Texas and South Carolina and Georgia. The one judge who sort of bucked that trend was in Louisiana and actually struck down racially gerrymandered maps, but then the Supreme Court stepped in, just as it did in Merrill v. Mulligan, and forced Louisiana to use the gerrymandered maps for this election. So that's something like 7 to 10 seats from racial gerrymandering that changed hands. And you add that to the partisan gerrymandering and to the redistricting, and you can count maybe 20 House seats that would have gone the other way had there been stronger protections for the basic principles of our democracy and not threats to those principles emanating from the judiciary itself. If you want to read more about that, Ellie Mista all over the Nation, Mark Stern over at Slate wrote some great stories about that. And I'll just add, this is like one of the reasons I'm so relieved about the Senate is that Biden has like nearly 60 judicial nominees awaiting hearing or confirmation. I think there are something like 90 vacancies total. And these midterms prevent a repeat of what Mitch McConnell did to President Obama during Obama's last 2 years of blocking every judicial nominee, including Merrick Garland, to the Supreme Court, which is part of why the House is now. Anyway, full circle.
Yeah. So just to clarify the one part that you said, so there's at least 3 states where basically the maps were said to be racially gerrymandered by courts, but the Supreme Court said, well, yeah, but let's use them anyway. And very likely, possibly in the next House and full election 2 years from now, those maps could be totally different because they'll have gone through the court system.
Yeah, the Supreme Court in particular in Alabama, in Merrill v. Mulligan, and then in Louisiana, Argoin, sure how you say it, v. Robinson, stepped in particular. And then lower court judges took their cues from the Supreme Court in South Carolina and Texas.
Well, one of the other things, obviously, we're concerned about, not just in the elections, but for our country overall, is this rise of Christian nationalism, which we're very happy to have you as an expert on our staff, and you've written 2 books about it. Spearheaded that groundbreaking report on the role that it played in the January 6th insurrection with other leading experts and some of our partners. So, what happened to Christian nationalist candidates in this midterm?
Yeah, so I mean, the report that you mentioned actually aroused congressional interest. And the January 6th committee asked me to turn the section that I wrote in that testimony and augment it with some of the Christian nationalists who took part in the insurrection that were also running for higher office. So I was actually already tracking some of these candidates for this election cycle for over a year now. And the short version is what Rachel said, that Christian nationalism lost. It seemed to be a liability in this election for the most part. People were voting against extremism, and Christian nationalism is religious extremism. And I just want to highlight a few cases because I know people are thinking, well, what about this person? They won. First, there were actually a lot of Christian nationalists that lost early on in the primaries. And I think that turned out to be a signal of things to come. So there's Idaho Lieutenant Governor Janice McGeachin. She tried to primary the governor and lost. She'll be out of office in January. You may remember her from her ad where she was posing with a gun and a Bible in one hand and the gun in the other. And she hosted a mask burning, I believe. I think she said that something like God calls us to pick up the sword and fight, and that Christ will reign in the state of Idaho when she is elected. Another one who lost a primary was Arkansas State Senator Jason Raper, who was running for lieutenant governor. He was the driving force behind the Ten Commandments monument at the Arkansas Capitol and created the National Association of Christian Lawmakers, which pushes bills in all 50 states, sort of like Project Blitz. Another one was Rick Saccone, who lost his bid for Pennsylvania lieutenant governor, and he was actually at the insurrection. He posted a video where he said, "We're live here in front of the U.S. Capitol. They broke down the gates. We're trying to run out all the evil people and all the rhinos who have betrayed our president." He talks about the vanguard breaking through the barricades, and he signs off, "Until next time, in God we trust." And there were a few others at lower levels that also were at the insurrection and lost. Tennessee State Rep Terry Lynn Weaver is one. But there were also plenty of Christian nationalists that cruised through the primaries and then even on to victory. Marjorie Taylor Greene, probably Lauren Boebert, though I'm not giving up hope there yet. Plenty of others like Mary Miller. You may remember Mary Miller was the representative who favorably quoted Hitler at a rally the day before the insurrection. She later objected to the certifications from Arizona and Pennsylvania, famously said that our nation was founded as a Christian nation, which is the defining belief of Christian nationalism. Her husband was also at the insurrection, and he ran unopposed for a state House seat in Illinois. He live streamed part of Trump's rally and was affiliated with the 3%ers. But there are others who are losing. Sarah Palin looks to be losing, and even the wins, often in these redrawn districts, were less than what I did predict going in. In other words, the Christian nationalists that won underperformed pretty significantly. And I think that's what we're seeing happening in the Lauren Boebert race. And I mean, that's what happens when you come for church-state separation. And we also saw losses at the governor level, though maybe not the underperformance. Obviously, DeSantis won in Florida, Abbott won in Texas. But Kari Lake in Arizona, Dan Cox in Maryland both lost. So did Maryland Lieutenant Governor candidate Michael Truk, who was actually in my first book, The Founding Myth, Why Christian Nationalism is Un-American. And then Mastriano in the Pennsylvania governor race also lost. And he didn't just lose, he lost pretty badly by nearly 15 points. And I think this is worth highlighting for 2 reasons. The first is that he was a virulent Christian nationalist, truly unabashed. One of the most extreme people running, not just extreme candidates, extreme people. He featured prominently in that January 6th report and testimony that we just talked about. He was aligned with Andrew Torba, who founded that online cesspool of bigotry known as Gab. Torba also wrote a book advocating for Christian nationalism, which is subtitled something like A Biblical Guide for Taking Dominion Over Nations, something along those lines. And that's what lost, which is great. And the second reason I think that's important is that he was running against Josh Shapiro, who was Pennsylvania's Attorney General in 2018, and he famously launched a Department of Justice investigation into the abuse scandal in the Catholic Church. And the grand jury published that deeply disturbing 2018 report that made national and international news, in which I actually still have nightmares about. But he showed that Shapiro showed that churches are not above the law, and he just won. So I think that's pretty big too. And then the last piece that's just fantastic is that every Christian nationalist running to control our elections lost, it looks like. March Finsterman in Arizona was a big loss. Karamo in Michigan, another big loss. That means the next election is going to be much harder to steal, which is no small thing, especially if we're looking down the barrel of another January 6th type thing. And then the absolute final thing I'll say is the flip side of Christian nationalism. Every member of the Congressional Free Thought Caucus kept their seat. One of their 4 guiding principles is to protect the separation of church and state. And one of the founding members of that caucus is the incomparable Jamie Raskin, who also happens to be attending the Summit for Religious Freedom to talk about these very issues. And it's another reason you should register for it right now.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, there's so many candidates, and from the primaries all the way till now, and of course, all of those candidates will come together and impact the policies of our country and the states, of course. And that's where the incomparable Maggie Garrett from our policy shop comes in. Maggie, all of these things that Andrew's talking about is leading to the creation of the next Congress. And so tell us a little bit about the big picture, about how the election played out, what that means for how Congress will actually work, particularly on our issues. And then in a little bit, we'll talk a little about the lame duck too between now and January, but let's start with that.
Sure. Thanks so much. I do want to start this by acknowledging that they are still counting votes in the House. And so we don't know the exact numbers yet, but we have a pretty good idea of where we're going to end up. And actually, I'll start in the House, where the Republicans are expected to end up with a very slim majority, even just a couple of seats. So what does that mean for us as it switches from the Democrats to the Republicans in the House? Republicans will be in leadership, and that means that they are going to have the majority members in committees. So they get to control what bills get hearings, what bills get markups, and what bills make it to the floor. They get to control the floor calendar, which means when bills go to the floor, and again, which bills go to the floor. And they even get to decide whether or not they'll allow amendments to those bills. They get to decide which amendments they allow and whether they'll even allow any amendments at all. So they can prohibit the Democrats from actually offering any amendments if they want to. And just for like a real feel of what that means, I'll use the Equality Act, which is the bill that would have extended civil rights protections to LGBTQ people and others. The Democrats, they gave that and this isn't being partisan, it's just what their policy positions are. That bill had a hearing, that bill was marked up, that bill passed in the House. And when they were expecting some Republican amendments that would harm the bill, they said no amendments. That is going to be the opposite of what happens now, right? The party in control voted against the Equality Act, majority of them. So they will not be putting bills like that on the floor. They're going to be putting likely bills that allow discrimination into the committees and onto the floor. And if the Democrats want to amend them, they will likely be prohibiting that. So we're going to be faced with more bills that we don't like getting oxygen. In addition, we're going to see a lot of bills that aren't obviously church state bills. Think things like spending bills, defense bills, tax bills, social service bills, literally anything you can think of, having bad church state provisions hidden in them. There's oftentimes they'll sort of just mess with the language a little bit, change things up a little bit, and it will actually end up funding private schools or funding houses of worship, those sorts of things. So a lot of our work in the House is going to be defensive now. It's going to be making sure that bad language isn't embedded in the start, because it's going to be Republican bills that are the basis of any legislation that moves. So trying to prevent that from getting into the bill. If it's in the bill, trying to get it removed. In contrast, this Congress, what we did is we fought to get good language in those bills, and we fought to protect that language and support that language. And we'll also be making sure our messages are part of the debate in the House. So when there are bad bills, when there is bad messaging, we will be educating people on the Hill, we will be mobilizing people, and we will be making sure that our message about why that language is bad gets out there. So our work in the House is going to be really challenging. At the same time in the House, excuse me, current projections of the Republicans will only have like a 3-person majority. And that means that for them to pass anything, they need all but like 2 members of their caucus to vote with them. If they lose any of those 2 members, they have to rely on Democrats for those votes. That means they have to keep their right wing and their moderate side happy. And if they do make them happy, say someone is ill, someone can't travel for a vote, a seat is vacated, there's a snowstorm, they have to hold up all of their votes because they won't have the right number of votes. So that means they can't go too far left, they can't go too far. There's a very narrow lane for them to pass things, and it's going to be incredibly, incredibly difficult. On the Senate side, it's currently 50-49 with Democrats in control. If Warnock loses, we'll be in the same spot we are now. Equal members, Republicans and Democrats in committees. The Democrats are controlling the agenda, equal members on the floor. And so if there's a tiebreaker, Vice President Harris has to come in and vote and break that tie. If Warnock wins, the Democrats will have more power. They'll have the majority on committees. It'll be easier for them to get legislation out. They won't need the vice president. They won't need both Sinema and Manchin. They will just need one of them. And so having the House and the Senate controlled by different parties means a lot of good bills won't get passed, but the Senate can do something really, really important still, and that is confirm judges. We hope that the Senate confirms a lot of them. There are currently more than 100 judicial vacancies waiting to be filled by the Senate. They've already confirmed 84 lifetime judicial nominees by President Biden, and they are shaping the courts now in a more progressive direction. They're incredibly diverse as compared to prior judges on the court. And so what we'll spend our time doing, now that that's sort of the landscape of the Senate, we'll be educating, we'll be getting good language in bills, we'll be preventing bad language. And one of the things I think we're also going to be doing a lot of in the Senate, because it's so close again, is preventing our issues from being the compromise point. A lot of times there'll be like a big tax bill, there'll be a big spending bill. It'll be like the government's going to shut down, so let's just give them that money to churches, or just give that money to whatever. And so we will be there to make sure that those compromises aren't made.
That's great. So I always like to, anybody that says that the race in Georgia doesn't matter because it's already 50 on one side, Maggie is setting them straight. One of the, just thinking about what you're talking about, the education that's so important for, letting folks know about our issues. One of the cool parts about the Summit for Religious Freedom is that the last day is a lobby day on Capitol Hill. So the evening before the latter half of the conference, we do a small training on the issues and how to meet with your senator and representatives. And then the next day, we bring everybody to Capitol Hill. We have a great kickoff session. And then our folks will be taking you to go visit with your local representatives to talk about, these issues that you all care about. So I think that's a really exciting thing. And it goes right along with what you were saying, Maggie, of what we're going to be able to do in a divided Congress. Do you, thinking about, we just still have a few weeks before that new Congress starts. That time is called the lame duck session. We even had one question today to talk about the Respect for Marriage Act that was, first vote was just taken today. Can you talk a little bit about what action we might expect on our issues in lame duck, and then maybe specifically a little bit about the Respect for Marriage Act, what it is, what happened today, and one of the questions is it really the full protection that folks are making it out to seem?
Sure. And I apologize, I keep coughing. I'm just getting over COVID, so I have this like lingering cough. So I apologize. I know it's kind of annoying. So the Respect for Marriage Act, that is something that is literally happening this week. There was a vote this morning, actually this afternoon. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Respect for Marriage Act, the Dobbs decision, the decision that overturned Roe, said there's no right, that's what said there's no right to an abortion, has put Obergefell, the case that guarantees marriage equality for same-sex couples, and Loving, the case that protects interracial marriages, into doubt. So the same core rights that provide the right to abortion are the same core rights that are used to guarantee the right for marriage equality and for interracial marriages. And so when that obviously went down in Dobbs, it put into question what that meant for these other cases. And in addition, Justice Thomas, in his concurring opinion, said these should go next. And so in order to, that is the law of the land is Obergefell. The Constitution says that there is a right for marriage equality. But what if the court changes their mind? Where are they going? And so the RMA cements these decisions into federal law, removing uncertainty for people who are already married or wanting to get married. And so it is a good day to celebrate. I think there's lots of questions around what is this religious language that they added into the bill. And to be honest, I don't think that the religion language changes the bill that much. Essentially, it says, it cements marriage equality and says whatever federal laws about marriage or constitutional protections about religion apply. And so like, that's a true statement. Whatever applies. It doesn't set out anything in particular. It doesn't highlight something like RFRA over other bills. And so I think that in the end, I think that it is, that it's an okay provision in order to get 60 votes. The other things just to say in the lame duck session, again, judges. People are really pushing, even though the Senate will remain in the hands of the Democrats, are trying to get as many done before the next session as they can. And then we are still pushing for a hearing on the Do No Harm Act. That is the bill that would fix RFRA, the National Religious Freedom Law. It would ensure that RFRA can't be used to grant exemptions that harm others. There's very little time left. There are some room on the Judiciary Committee calendar. The Judiciary Committee loves this issue. And so we'll keep fighting for that. But otherwise, they're going to be doing funding bills, leadership roles, and defense bills.
Great. No, thanks, Maggie. That's really, it's so, as somebody who worked on the marriage equality issue for over a decade, I think it highlights that, no matter what we fight for, we have to always continue to be vigilant to continue to try and protect that. We saw that in the Dobbs decision and the stripping of bodily autonomy and personal freedom, and marriage equality, and a few others were listed in Justice Thomas's opinion as well. So it's very exciting to see this small step forward. One state issue we wanted to bring up because it's so fundamentally tied to church-state separation, Arkansas. So Arkansas narrowly rejected a religious freedom amendment to their state constitution that could have had a negative impact on the issues that you've been talking about and we care about. Can you just briefly talk a little about the ballot measure and what it was and what may have helped the outcome swing our way?
Sure. I think this issue is somewhat fascinating. So there's a little known ballot initiative in Arkansas called Issue 3. Actually, it was put on the ballot by someone that Andrew already mentioned, Representative Jason Rapert. So it's the most straightforward church state issue on the ballot. So even though that state has a state RFRA, the religious freedom laws that essentially allow religious exemptions to any state law that there is, Jason Rapert decided that he wanted to add it into the Constitution as well. So they have it in the statute. He wants to put it even sort of a worse version, a way to it's easier to discriminate against people. He wanted it in the Constitution. And there's only a 50% threshold to pass a constitutional amendment in Arkansas. And to our surprise, it failed. It only got 49.57% of the vote. So how did this happen? I know we're running short on time, so I'm just going to go through it really fast. One, people didn't know what it did. And so usually for ballot initiatives, if you don't know what it means, you usually vote no, because it's safer to go with the status quo. Two, conservatives who didn't really know what it was were saying vote against it because they thought it wasn't strong enough. Because there's a provision in there that says that the government has a compelling interest, they don't have to grant the exemption. They were like, whoa, that's a trap. Don't vote for that because they could, deny us religious exemptions when they have a compelling interest to do so. And so some of the people on the right voted no. And then our side didn't really fight it because we didn't really have the resources. We didn't really think that we would win it. And so I think in a way that actually helped because it continued to allow sort of the misunderstanding of what it did rather than, maybe someone on the far right would have been like, oh, I can discriminate with this. Great, I'll vote yes. So to me, this sort of picks up the pieces of how it's so interesting that elections can be so different state to state, district to district. Local things can make a really big difference. And so each election fight is different than the other.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to track everything going on in states because there's so many things going on, but that one really did stick out and stuck out both for content, but also how much it didn't stick out in so many folks' minds of even knowing. I think it wasn't even until close to election day that I even tuned into that it was going on. So we're going to jump into some questions. Hopefully try to get through as many of those for folks as we possibly can, and then chat a little bit more. So let's go ahead. So Andrew, just a quick question from James. Is the Christian nationalist losses, do you think that was due to their extremism or just new to politics and we're just making political mistakes?
No, I don't think it was due to ineptitude. I mean, Christian nationalism is not new by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, we've seen waves of Christian nationalism throughout American history. And the wave that we're seeing right now has been building for some time. Trump tapped into it in the 2016 election in a way that we hadn't seen with the modern wave very successfully. One of the best predictors of a Trump voter, if not the best, was asking that person whether or not they thought the United States was founded as a Christian nation. So I don't think it was related to an experience. I think it was definitely related to extremism, and in this case, religious extremism. I think people are kind of fed up with it for the most part.
Yeah. A couple of questions that we answered in the background while folks were talking. Yes, Andrew is going to be speaking at the conference and his new book will be available there. Hopefully a little bit of a book reading as well. So for folks that are able to come. For the virtual conference, it does require registration on the same site. And again, we have scholarships available for that as well. What was the last one? That was it. Oh, the recording will be available. We'll be mailing that to you after this so that you'll be able to. And the lobby day, it is in person only. So that part of the conference, you do have to be there to participate in lobby day. Next question is, tremendously grateful. This is from Karya. Apologize if I mispronounced it. Grateful for the Gen Z folks in this election. They really showed up. Do you think the red wave that was anticipated, that Gen Z had a big impact on that? Do you think the GOP thought, just kind of took them for granted? I'm rephrasing the question just a little bit. So what impact do you think that Gen Z had on the turnout and the results in this election?
I'll take a stab first. I mean, I don't think you can underestimate the impact of the election. We're going to get better numbers in a couple months is when then you can really start to dive into the data and be a nerd. A lot of what we're going off of right now are exit polls. But I mean, it seems pretty clear that they had a remarkable impact on the election overall, especially kind of restraining that extremism that I was talking about. Rachel wrote a nice week in review about this a couple weeks ago too, or a week ago.
And Maggie, this is from Craig. Just confirming, Vice President Harris can vote to break ties on judicial nominations, correct?
Yes, correct. She's done it many times.
And Stephen is asking, with it being such, a close house, do you think that, and I'll actually pose this both ways, do you think there's a chance that a few Republicans will cross the aisle or Democrats will cross the aisle for, I guess either switch parties like a permanent or crossover for, specific votes and specific bills?
I have not heard of anyone considering switching parties. I do think that there are some new, more moderate Republicans, like thinking about like the New York area, where there are some folks who have said, I'm not going to vote for a national abortion ban, or I'm not going to take on some of those issues. I've heard of some people, I think it was Bacon of Nebraska has said like he would vote for the Democrats on certain things if it came to it. So I do think that some Republicans would vote for the Democrats on some of these issues. And I mean, honestly, there are some Democrats who will vote for with the Republicans on some of these issues. We've got Manchin, we've got Sinema. There's definitely, moderate Democrats who would do that as well, depending on the issue.
Yeah, I think I was reading something today that the pipeline reform, I know this is not church-state separation, but something that Manchin is trying to push, that Republicans are now saying in the lame duck that they are now open to crossing over and voting to support that piece of legislation. We've got a couple of questions about the Johnson Amendment, and they're kind of, the Johnson Amendment. So just for folks that aren't familiar, the Johnson Amendment is regulation that requires nonprofit organizations like churches, as well as AU, who are 501c3, cannot endorse a political candidate or political party. And there's been a lot of complaints about enforcement of the Johnson Amendment, seeing pastors in their churches, not even just endorsing. We saw some pastors that were running for office collecting donations, like literally in the pews. So I think the general question from folks on a couple of these is, where does this stand? What can be done? If one of you wants to talk about, folks kind of wonder, can we sue? But, there's some specific restrictions on who can bring, a lawsuit when it comes to the Johnson Amendment. So if you two want to just kind of address where that is, what folks can do, what's happening with it, what the IRS can and should be doing or isn't doing.
I'm happy to start, Andrew, if you want to jump in after. So the Johnson Amendment. The Johnson Amendment is very important. We have spent a lot of time protecting the Johnson Amendment. It was almost, Trump says he destroyed it. He did not. He destroyed it. The Congress actually almost eliminated it. We fought very, very hard. We led the coalition to protect it. It is still very important. Yes, a lot of people are violating the Johnson Amendment. And yes, you're kind of like, what's the point of having the Johnson Amendment if all of these people are violating the Johnson Amendment? I will say that more people adhere to the Johnson Amendment than violate the Johnson Amendment, right? So it's still really important. The majority of the people out there are adhering to this. But yes, it's really difficult to feel good about it when you know that there are people flagrantly violating it, and sometimes not so aware that are very clearly violating it. There is no private cause of action, meaning like you can't do something to like sue a church, or you can't take action to remove someone's tax exempt status or to somehow help penalize them. You can, and we have done this in the past, and we did it actually pretty recently. We can, and you can report houses of worship to the IRS. But I think that the IRS is in sort of this sticky spot at the moment where they, kind of want to enforce it. Do they want to enforce it? They want to get involved in it. And we have been, we've sent letters to the IRS saying, you need to enforce this. And here's an example of how you need to enforce it. And so we are still pushing for enforcement. But I recognize how frustrating it can be as people are violating it.
I think that's a great answer. I'll just add two minor things. The people who are pushing to overturn the Johnson Amendment are actually like pretty small, vocal, fringe minority that are working to overturn it. I mean, by and large, the rule is incredibly popular with faith leaders, with nonprofits, with the country at large. People like this rule. It makes sense. We want charitable donations to go to charitable works, not political campaigns. Pretty basic rule. The other thing I will mention too is that all the IRS investigations into churches that violate the Johnson Amendment are confidential. We would not know about them unless the church itself openly talked about it or challenged any IRS action in court. So there's also a bit of just we don't know if / what is happening behind the scenes, which I think adds to everybody's frustration.
I think I have to add something on the Johnson Amendment. It's one of our favorite topics. I will just say that we all know that there's a reticence as well when it comes to religion, in this country. And I think that's one of the things that we have to take on, which is we can have a huge amount of respect for religion if we choose to, but still say that religion is not above the law. And, when it comes to the Johnson Amendment, that applies to us at AU as a nonprofit, just as much as it applies to any church or synagogue or mosque. And, if we're held to it, so should, houses of worship be. But I think, in this country, there is this mislabeling of holding religion accountable as being anti-religion. And we have to get over that if church-state separation is going to be strong and survive in this country. So that's something that Americans United is going to be working on. And one of the ways that we're going to be confronting this mislabeling of church-state separation and holding religion accountable as being anti-religion is through putting clergy out front and center to join with non-believers and civil rights proponents and, frankly, all Americans in advocating for a healthy and strong wall of separation.
We had a couple of folks talking about turnout. And I'll actually take a stab as our outreach director here. But one person asked, in Texas, Wisconsin, Ohio, and Florida, only about a third of eligible voters turned up. What can we do to get more folks out? Teresa mentioned, is there a plan to breaking into demographics who have been voting traditionally against religious freedom? She mentioned that some data about potentially married women and how can we best reach and influence that voting bloc. I think what we've found, as far as getting people engaged to go out to vote, especially folks that are going to vote for religious freedom and church-state separation, and this is my conversion story from my previous work. Is when people see how church-state separation really connects to all the different issues that they care about. If you pass a law, that you agree with, expanding civil rights, but then, a Christian nationalist majority is elected into a legislator or a judge rules, based on historical precedent, as our Supreme Court mentioned, we lose those gains. So I think when people see, there's a reason we talk about church-state separation as the shield that protects, our rights and the things that we've achieved, and that's true because it is supposed to be the shield that stops religion or one narrow religious belief or view to be imposed through law, onto all of us. We saw that with the Dobbs decision, and people of different faiths who have different opinions about if and when you can have an abortion. People who have no faith who also have different opinions. But at this point, we're looking at potentially living in a state or down the road a nation where everybody would have to abide by an abortion law that is from one specific narrow religious belief. So I think when we start to talk to folks about church-state separation in those respects, protecting public schools and the work that happens there, we want to talk about, people who are married, people who have families, they want strong public schools. They want their kids to have strong public schools. And if we talk about, church state separation, makes sure that the kids don't feel bullied into, participating in prayer, from their coach at a school, or taking their tax dollars and sending it to, private schools where their child, because their child is Muslim or gay, wouldn't be allowed to, attend. Those types of things, I think, resonate with parents, and resonate with families, and get them to become church state separation voters. They're out there. They exist. They just don't know sometimes that is their issue as well, and it's the foundation or the needle and thread that kind of weaves through everything they care about. Any of my colleagues, want to share, how we get people more engaged and energized about the topic, to turn out to vote, but also to, to donate, to volunteer, to, do all the things we need to keep pushing back.
I'll just mention that some of the threats to democracy that I touched on at the beginning also have an effect on turnout, deliberately so too, right? Like we know that a lot of the voting is often made difficult on people, and not just so that they can't vote, but so that they throw up their hands and say, what's the point? And so, I think we could do small d democratic reform across the board in this country to protect and expand the franchise to all. That would go a long way, I think, to increasing turnout.
Maggie, one of our questions folks were asking about, in the states, and it might just be too early to even think about, or maybe just thinking about some of the state sessions that, ended this year or came towards the end, what type of legislation, are we seeing at the state level or being concerned about, besides specifically related to things like the Establishment Clause? Is there anything that's on our radar, or was on our radar from, coming off of this past year, that we're also going to be keeping an eye out for?
I think that we're going to continue to see vouchers everywhere, just siphoning off money that should go to our public schools to go to private religious schools that can discriminate, that don't have the same protections for students. I think that's going to continue to be a really big problem. And this is all sort of mixed in together, really, with the CRT bills and the Don't Say Gay bills. In addition to those types of bills being harms in themselves, they are actually part of a system to create distrust of our public schools, so that people are like, oh, I don't really know about these public schools, we should give money to private schools. And so it's all working together to privatize our private schools. So I think we're going to see all of those types of bills come up. I think we're going to see a lot of religious exemptions, broader religious exemptions sort of everywhere. But it is really, it's really hard to gauge just yet, because there's some states, it's really a mixed bag in the states. Like some states have super majorities now, like Florida, Iowa, North Carolina, South Carolina. But at the same time, some states like Michigan have more Democrats than they've ever had before, or like Pennsylvania, where the Democrats might take over the House chamber for the first time in a really long time. So it's hard to sort of pinpoint exactly what we will see there, but they're going to keep us busy. That I am very sure of.
They always do. They always do. Well, there's been a lot of positive news tonight. There's also a lot of things to be worried about. But what I think is important to know, at least from our perspective at AU, is we have been planning for this election for whichever way it was going to go, both long and short term. And I think that's important to know what some of the plans are to fight back against these things and continue to protect the wins we have, and what some of the strategies are for the future. So Rachel, what do you see as some of the key takeaways for AU from this election, and our path forward as an organization to keep protecting this fundamental democratic value?
Yeah. So first of all, I just want to say, I was just skimming through some of the questions in the inbox, and I saw one on, is AU doing anything to reach women? What about all these married women who voted the wrong way? And I just, I wanted to say, that we actually have been making immense efforts to reach women. Our movement as a whole tends to be more male heavy. And it's interesting being the female leader of a group, like this. And I'm really proud to say that was just talking to our direct mail people today and receiving a presentation. And in this past year, we've brought in equal numbers of men and women, to AU as members, which is great. So I do think we're speaking more to women. I think, we are, like Brian was saying, right, connecting the dots to all these issues that I think women care about, like abortion and contraception. We have legal battles going on those issues. We do a lot of work on those issues. But also what I found from some of my own focus groups with some of our female members is they care about democracy. Women care about democracy and preserving democracy, and talking about Americans United's role in preserving democracy draws women to us. And we certainly are playing a very important role in this moment in protecting our democracy. A few quick takeaways from the election in terms of AU's work. Our investments are making a lot of sense. So that's great. I think the election confirmed that. Number one, and you've heard a lot about this, we're investing in youth. We have our high school essay contest. We've never received more applicants. We have our youth organizing fellowship. We're in our third year. These are incredibly gifted young people, diverse from all over the country, different backgrounds, different racial and religious backgrounds, and they are true leaders on this issue. And we are giving them the tools they need to lead into the future. Right. And they're with us for a year, and it's gotten amazing feedback. We are running a legal academy. And if you don't know about it, we're pretty proud of it because it's fighting back against what the Federalist Society has been doing for 40 years. And also some of our opponents at Alliance Defending Freedom are doing with the Blackstone Institute. We partnered with 11 organizations and brought together law students this past summer from law schools all across the country, 60 of them, to network them to power and to each other, to give them hope. And boy, their reviews, we did them every day, and of every session were incredible. So we're investing in them. And finally, Brian, I'm getting the wrap it up eyes. I just want to say that we're also investing in growing our movement. And that's what SURF, the Summit for Religious Freedom, is about. It's about helping others join us and helping us all exist together in a bigger community, because we need the numbers to win. And I think we saw in this election that people are primed to join us. They get it. And the threats are elevated. They understand what it's connecting to better than ever, what church-state separation is about. We're going to seize that moment. So Brian, I just hope everyone will be with us. We have the Next Generation Fund going to raise money. We've already raised $500,000 for our Next Generation Fund, and we hope to double that. So please, if you can, give what you can. End of the year gifts are coming, and support AU. And just so grateful for this community right now, and including my amazing colleagues. And thank you to our translator as well.
Great, thanks, Rachel. So one of the cool things about SURF, just to give a plug, is even though right now we're going to be wrapping up, at SURF you can come up and talk to us afterwards and ask us more questions, because we know we still had quite a few questions to get there. Just as a reminder, these types of webinars happen throughout the year between the in-person conference. We have our registration. The early bird discount ends on Monday, so please check it out at the srf.org. If you're an AU member, you do receive a discount. You should have gotten an email about that. If not, reach out to us. We have scholarships to cover travel, hotel, registration, or any combination. Also scholarships for attending the virtual portion. Our next webinar for SURF will be in early spring of next year. We don't know the exact date or topic, because part of the reason for the continuous conference is so we can plan it with what's happening in the moment, in mind, and we can respond, to that, right when and where it's happening. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for being here. We'll be sending out a link to the recording tomorrow to everybody who registered. and have a good evening and take care.